Gagasi FM, good morning, Merry Christmas. So today is a Christmas Day special of E-Elevate, and we're bringing you Santa Claus ngekanenzele lutho khuleka. Santa Claus akaphethe nix. I have with me a young lady. I'm going to call her a young lady because we're still expecting a lot of things from her. Ayanda Borotho. She is a speaker, an author, and an actress. She hails from Ntuzuma Kwasi. Now she belongs to the entire continent of Africa through her screen work and many things that she does on philanthropy and umsebenzi awenzayo in entrepreneurship nezinye izinto eziningi azenzayo. So help me welcome on this Christmas special Miss Ayanda Borotho, or rather Ayanda Borotho. I know you're very specific about that. Someone.
Ngiyaphila kakhulu. Thank you for having me, Khulekani. It's been a long time coming.
It's been a long time. Here. I'm very happy. You know, when I got the call, literally, whenever you do this kind of job, it's always you calling the artists and the workers like, guys, can I please? Like getting the call from you to me like, okay, I'm ready. Can we do it? Absolutely ecstatic. Tell me about this one thing, Mangubane. You always want to mention it. You always pay homage to Abantu Bagini Ombom for Somahash. Tell me about that. When was that born out of you, and why did it come about?
I am because of my parents. And I don't want to ever forget that. I think there was a time in my life when I did, when I transitioned into marriage, and then when I got to a place where I found Uti engathi angisazazi, I wanted to go back to that. And so for me, igama la Ayanda Borotho was not always the default, but Ayanda Ngubane, and then Ayanda Borotho, and then at some point I changed the name brand to Ayanda Borotho. And it's important to me because, like you say, paying homage to my mother, my father, Ombovo Somahash Ongman, because there's a deep sense of realization of the identity that is because of who they are and what they had instilled in me, and I never want to lose that. I think it is the one thing that defines me as me outside of the one I'm with.
Yeah.
I think for some time, like I say, when I transitioned into marriage, and that sense of loss, loss and belonging to something that you actually really don't know, that you're trying to build. And then feeling like, no, actually, Gisao Ayanda, just because ngashada, don't cease to exist. And so I wanted to make sure Uguti, I put emphasis on that.
And you don't lose yourself.
And I don't lose myself. Yeah.
So I want to dive in deep now. There are two books that have now come from you. The first one, Unbecoming to Become. You cited something in that book, and you spoke, I think, in the year 2020 when we had you on the show, Ukuluma, about your grandmother. She was a very powerful figure in your family. She was a figure that meant a lot to you. What is the role of black women, and specifically in families nowadays, as opposed to what society dictates to them, or rather, what should it be? And I'm referencing Ukokwako because you looked up to her as a matriarch of the family, and you cited certain things that masakudlule emhlabeni kunezinye izinto engenzekanga. We're seeing a lot of women, as you're saying, losing themselves into this constitution of marriage now, saying, "Hi, gege, angisayena usibani wakabani, sengowaka Mbambo." What would you have to say to that?
Yazi mangakhuluma ngerole umuntu esifazane singahlala la unyaka wonke. I think for me what's important to understand, and I say this in my book, masibuyele emuva si bega igama lika Eve in the Bible, who was the first woman that God created, and I always refer to her as the divine feminine God manifestation.
Yeah.
Not necessarily as umuntu wesifazane, but the God in his or her divinity.
Yes.
Manifested as a female. Masibheka igama la Eve. and trace it back to Latin. It actually means ever. And then we should trace it back ever to Hebrew. In Hebrew, that word is made up by two words, chaya and chava. One meaning to breathe, and the other one to give life.
Wow.
So in essence, ngokwendabuko noma ngokomoya womuntu wesifazane ukuphila. Ngizomsummarize nje ngithi ukuphila ngoba mase sihlale la sim break it down sim unlay sizokhuluma kuze kuse, but ngokwami ngiyaye ngithi umuntu wesifazane ukuphila ngoba uthi mayisefika endaweni bese letha ukukhanya. That is why ungangakhela ikhaya noma ungangakhela umuzi kodwa umuzi awubi ikhaya engekho umuntu wesifazane ngoba uyena afika alethe lokho kuphila lokho. There's also been a misconception by many, especially in church circles, because of the religious narrative that says we are helpers. Again, when you look at the helper word, when umuntu wesifazane is described as a helper to Adam. By the way, it was Adam waiting usizo kwangena uEve waiting usizo. So nje just clarify le
I like that. Yeah.
So umubheka the word helper in the Bible and you trace it back to what that word meant in Hebrew, because you can have various words in the Bible that say the same thing but mean different things.
Different things, yes.
And in this particular instance, this kind of helper was ueza. Yes, Hebrew. Yes, Hebrew ueza uchaza a different kind of help. It's not the help that is of servanthood, where ngiwumuntu oqashiwe noma ngiwumuntu omsizi ozokuseva. But actually that word means rescuer. Umuntu wesifazane mangithi ukuphila ufike alethe usizo olurescuisha isizwe.
Not just the man.
Not just the man.
Yes.
Afike azorescuisha isizwe. Ingakho ngeke ngithi mangibuka the state of affairs in our country, if you just had more women in roles and positions of authority where women can make decisions that can propel the country forward, that can propel society forward, we would have really done ourselves a justice, a huge justice, because
she doesn't need to engineer it.
No, ingakho we were the ones who attended to our masim. Why do you think we have a special relationship with the soil? Women have a special relationship with the soil because we are life. Esikuvunayo, it must come to life.
And I think it's so significant, using the word helper again, that there is another figure in the Bible, which is now the Holy Spirit, who's mentioned and called a helper. So it speaks of the same thing, the significance of umuntu wesifazane. Now, I wanna talk to you. I know there's a lot of people who always speculate things about your relationships, umshado. You're very vocal about gender-based violence, and people often think, under that makeup.
Yeah.
Why so that you speak about gender-based violence? I know that a few years ago there's a friend of yours who lost her life due to gender-based violence. Is that something that made you come out and speak out?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. I think there's a link between the GBV conversation and the toxic patriarchy conversation that I try to unlayer in my book, because so maybe let's start here. When I wrote Unbecoming to Become, I was in a very dark space. From outside looking in, alrighty, you've got it all together. She's, married by societal standards. Alright, she's I don't know whether I'm supposed to greet ukhaya now at this point or what I'm supposed to do. Ufuna ungena manje wena la kule podcast manungena angisazi fanele
Show yakhe iphele ngo-3.
manje usumane weza wazo omala
Iphele ngo-3 show
ufuna
yakho.
kwenziwe njani. How are you? Ngijabulile nami hamba kahle.
Banokushumayela ngo-Christmas.
Sekuwena.
Yeah, don't cut that out now.
I was waiting for him to know when to pick it up from.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so I was saying I was in a very dark space. But there was this deep sense of sadness. And now, on hindsight, when I think about it, I can give it a name or an identity. Grief, because I realize now that that sadness, that deep sense of sadness, came from a place of mourning. Like I was mourning myself because I'd lost so much of who I was. Ngangiphila ngibizwa uma nkosikazi. She's an actress. But zonke lezi zinto zazingangenzi mina. So somewhere along the line, I felt that there was a sense of loss of identity in terms of who Ayanda was. And then, so I have a conversation with God, right? In fact, this is the first page on the book.
Yeah.
I'm going to paraphrase it, but it says, "Dear God, would it be true that if I am made in your likeness and in your image, would it be true that then you manifest yourself twice?" And God says, "Why?" And I said, "Well, because you manifest yourself as a superior being in men and manifest yourself as an inferior being in women." And God says, "Why do you ask?" And I said, "Well, because that's what the world and society has taught me." Then God says, "Go on a journey to find yourself. And there, where you find yourself, you will find me also." And so, and this was a real conversation. I don't know how to describe it, man. Khulekani.
No, I get it.
It was a real conversation between the divine and I. And so I did. And the journey was a journey of healing. Hence, the book is called Unbecoming to Become, the journey back to self. Unbecoming to become, the premise being that perhaps the journey is not about becoming anything, but that perhaps the journey is about unbecoming everything that the world has ever taught you.
Removing certain layers.
So that you can become all that God had created you to be. So I had to identify the coats, I call them coats in the book, and the layers that I had put on myself and that society had forcefully put on me. And layers that were put on me in Gagasi, subconsciously, that I needed to take off to get to the bottom of who I was as Ayanda, because I'd lost that woman that I'd met many years ago, and I wanted to find her again. And so I go on this journey, and essentially all of the chapters are about different parts or different chapters of my life. I always say it's not a bio, because you'll never find my date of birth. You won't find it's not hi, my name is Ayanda Mangubani, I was born on the, it's not that.
Yeah.
But what it does is it unpacks how patriarchy showed up in the different chapters of my life and how that then shaped me. And so I went on a journey to unpack that for myself, and then go on a journey of understanding how that impacted how I showed up in the world and what I needed to do about it. The traumas it created, it caused, and what I needed to do about the traumas. And so when I talk about the relationship between GBV and toxic patriarchy, I mean it in the sense that GBV was by default something that I would talk about, because it is a symptom or a manifestation of toxic patriarchy. But also GBV is much bigger than just umuntu wesifazane oshawayo, umuntu wesifazane othukwayo, umuntu wesifazane. It's a societal issue. It's a societal issue deeply embedded in how we're socialized, how we're indoctrinated through whether it's religion, family structures, just in terms of how society works. And if we're able to understand what the root cause of GBV, qala ekutheni abantu besilisa bakhuliswe kanjani nokuthi bambuka kanjani umuntu wesifazane. A lot of our issues, I think, as society, and especially between men and women and how we engage, or the toxic issues between how men and women engage, are as a result of the dethroning of umuntu wesifazane. Because umuntu wesifazane has been dethroned in society. And so for me, the book was about throning her and finding an identity that we could all identify with as women. An identity that says, this is actually who we are, and this is what the world has forgotten about who we are as women. Because umumiswa, a traffic cop,
Yeah.
uyama, umiso umuntu, kodwa yini ekumisayo?
It's a traffic cop.
Ile
It's an
uniform
official.
ayigqokile.
Yeah.
Ile nto ayigqokile. Ngoba
Yeah.
le nto ayigqokile imnika i-authority ethize.
Yes.
Umuntu wesifazane wakhunyulwa ingubo zakhe ayigqokile ezimnika i-authority ethize. Sambathiswa okusimbozayo ubuthina. Ingakho isizwe the world doesn't see the real us, but sees that which has been layered over us.
So talking about patriarchy now, the toxicity of it, you've mentioned that it manifests itself in different forms and in different spaces. What was the most surprising one for you? You've mentioned church, family, workspaces. What was the most perhaps surprising one to see?
It's an interesting question. I don't know if I've ever really thought about that, Khulekani, asking me deep questions. So let me start by clarifying this. I think patriarchy is necessary and important. I think men are important in society.
It's the toxicity of
It's
it.
the toxicity of it. I love men. I think men. I want men to function with us in a way that is positive, and in a way that is functional and healthy for society. So, ngifuna clarify a lot because there's often been a misconception when I speak about these things that mina ngwafuna madoda, and then obviously you're a feminist, and we can talk about the feminism thing a little bit later. But amadoda siyawadinga. Angazi ukuthi ngiqalephi. You know, ukudlala uphumelele kwangisiza ngendlela eziningi.
Yeah.
Because I think as educated women, we think that comes with a certain kind of freedom or liberty. But walking in another woman's shoes who comes from a world yencindezi, and isizotha kuyona incindezi ngoba it's a world ejwayelekile.
It's a norm.
It's a norm.
Yeah.
Kodwa umbuka mangimdlalo umuntu osifazane kube khona into ethi hayi man koza nami kwami kenzeka lokho yabo.
Lima
So-
sababsini hayi la ezilalini.
Yeah, especially when Phumelele was going through a transitioning, South Africa used to call it Phumelele is unbecoming. We were going through a transitioning phase of trying to find herself and her voice. There were a lot of things that I had to ask myself. And I suppose even before then, umpi yakhe wayenesihlalo ahlala kusona.
Yeah.
And for those who don't know who Mpiake is, because now I have to qualify this, or I have to explain it, because we don't assume that everybody watched this Baya, right? But Mpiake was the character played by Siyabonga Twala, who was my husband on the show, who was the polygamist, married to me as the third wife actually, because there was a wife before, the one played by Uspogazi, who died, Maratandega, the character played by Palance, and then Phumelele was the third wife. So I've clarified who Mpiake is. So Mpiake, why nesihlalo? And I remember having this profound, just profound moment looking at this. Because I'd done it many times where the character would come and bring him his food. And then I realized, iyenzeka nalento kwami. It's not a problem.
Yeah.
Ukulethela indoda yakho ukudla. But we have to understand, ukuthi kunama power dynamics esiwacommunicateayo ey'nganeni zethu. Because iy'ngane they don't learn by what we tell them, they learn by what we see. Kunama power dynamics esiwacommunicateayo ey'nganeni zethu thina singaboni. Because uma akanasi isihlalo, kodwa ubaba unaso. And I've often had these conversations in spaces where I speak, and it's one of the questions I'd ask, ubani uqhamuka ekhaya la ubaba wayenesihlalo sakhe. Sasikhona yini esikamama?
Iplate likababa likhona lele
baba, ukhezo kababa, sasikhona yini esikamama? And the question then becomes, what are the power dynamics are we communicating to the people who are watching, who are seeing? Ubaba bears the authority, umama the responsibility. And so the question was, yini yangithusa? It was a subtle thing, but yangithusa because it made me realize, okay, or it forced me to go back and reevaluate my own life and the toxic patriarchal nuances in my own relationship. Yeah.
Do you think that toxic patriarchal people know that they are toxic in their patriarchy, or is it a way of upbringing that they saw? Kwaba into yokuthi nami masengimdala ngifuna isihlalo sami, ngifuna ukuthi kwami, ngifuna unkosikazi wami, ngifuna. Do you think that they know? And if they don't, what's the easiest way to awaken them? I'm making you like go very deep on this one.
Esingakwazi esingakatshelwa kona. So ukwazi ukublame umuntu okhuliswe ngendlela ethize and who doesn't know any better. But today we live in a world where we've got access to so much information, where we've got access to so many conversations, that to not put an effort in a relationship or a family or a home where you try your level best to equalize the power dynamics in the marriage, so that ingane zakho zingezucabanga ukuthi uma akayilutho. Because phela ingane uma icabanga ukuthi uma akayilutho zizohamba ziyofuna umuntu wesifazane ezizomenza angabi lutho naye.
And also them, even the females, when they get married, they know I'm expected to be a nothing.
So it's a never-ending cycle if we're not willing to be intentional, consciously intentional about changing the narrative. And so ngizwe kahle ngithi angeke sisimsola umuntu ongazi ngoba engakazazi atshelwe. When you don't know better, you don't do better. But when you know better, you do better. And that's why I say, for most of us now in this generation, there's the excuse, and the excuse for men usually is because you have to understand patriarchy, toxic patriarchy thrives on privilege. It's the privilege that they don't want to let go of
and to lose.
But I privilege yabo imi on the foundations of my disadvantage as umuntu wesifazane. And so often I think we'll have different groups of people. It's those that don't know, and the socialization and indoctrination is so deeply embedded in us that it's going to take a long time.
It is.
It is going to take
and
a long time.
And it has to be an intentional move.
Yeah, it's going to take a long time to change the narrative. But bese kuba khona laba abafuna ukubambelela kwi privilege, and that's why I love this quote ethi, when you've been accustomed to privilege, even equality seems like an injustice. So kwabanye sidila nezinto
it seems like you're being stripped of something when everyone is
like,
let's have an equal share.
To it. Kodwa manje musuyibuza uthi sibangani ngoba angikucindezeli ngithi asilingane kulento kodwa ngikucindeze so sibangani. Yini lesibangayo ngoba angibangi ukuthi angithi ngifuna ukuba ngaphezulu kwakho, ngithi mina ngifuna si recognize ngokulingana in our different ways, in our individual ways, but it's recognizing ngokulingana. Kungabi khona into ezongicindezela ngoba kuthiwa mina ngumuntu wesifazane beke khona into ekuphakamisa ngoba nje wena umuntu wesilisa. So ukhalelani wena mangithi akwenziwe kanjalo. Ukhala ngoba uyazi ukuthi kunama privileges ozowafofitha.
This now is getting into another side and another conversation among feminists, of which you've spoken out quite a few times about. Abantu abangama feminists most times bahlezi kuleli phuzo olushoyo, but in the wrong spectrum of it. Ukuthi asilinganeni, asifaneni. I want to be the same as you. I want to be actually sometimes even better than you. What would you say to them in terms of adjusting? Should they adjust, or should the men in that particular case adjust themselves? Because I know, let's concede. Aslinganen nababantu besifazane, mandoza wa keeping on many years ago with 50-50. What should we do?
Obviously, I'm a feminist because there are so many different feminists now. I don't even know which is which. Here's what I'll tell you about my thoughts on feminism. A lot of people tend to think or label me as a feminist, and that's fine. It's what people think, because of the issues I speak on, and that's why I'm often very intentional when I do interviews to say, "Leya patriarchy ngifuna si understand. Amadoda sawadinga sawafuna. Siwafuna ephelele, siwafuna functioning, right in their position, ngendlela right." I don't identify myself as a feminist. And I say this and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, come to the podcast. I decide to go to Funuk because I remember saying that, writing that on one of my posts, and the feminists came for me, like, and I'm just like, hi guys, I can decide to go to Mina. Oh, I'm umila. I don't identify myself as a feminist. And the simple reason is that I do not want to exist in light of what I'm fighting. And my identity cannot be because ngilwa nento ethize. If feminism ilwa khonelwa ne-toxic patriarchy kube khonelwa ne-patriarchy altogether. So that's why ngithi ngibuye ngabisho ukuthi kwenziwani. I identify as divine feminine, and not a feminist, because I want to exist because of who I am
and who God made you to be.
And who God made me to be, and not what I'm fighting. Otherwise, sizofana nalezi inhlangano ezathi mazilwa into engaka zathi mase zinqobile leyo nto zase zingasazi ukuthi seziyini, because you existed by virtue of what you are fighting. But uyini kahle kahle, ubani kahle kahle, mase kufanele ke manje ube ngoba i-existence yakho iukulwa. And I don't want to exist in defensive mode, nokulwa. I want to exist by who I am. Kunala sibuye sihluke khona futhi ne-feminism, I think, because I'm big on taking responsibility and guarding your identity and your light by virtue of who you are. Feminism ezokutshela ukuthi eyinganeni umzimba wakho lo, this is your body. And so you can and should do whatever you want ngomzimba wakho. Ngingakunika amalungelo ngomzimba wakho. Kodwa if ungazazi ukuthi ubani, awuzukuphatha kahle. Ngoba uzokwenza ungahambelani nalokho wena oyikho. Wazi nje ukuthi
it's my body. What I say goes.
But when you know who you are, I say this to young girls, when you know who you are, there is a responsibility that is placed upon you to guard that spirit, that soul, that identity, that light in who you are. So asikwazi ukunika ingane or ukuyifundisa ingane ukuthi zinamalungelo kodwa singayifundisa responsibility ehamba nalawo malungelo by virtue of who they are. And so yeah, kungasebenza because you're right, they are right. Imzimba yethu ngingenza noma yini ngomzimba wami. But into ezoba icampus yokuthi umzimba wami ngiwuphatha kanjani and the responsibility I have towards this body can only be guarded by knowing who I am. If I don't know who I am, I'll do with this body as I please. And that's not going to help me. So I'm just giving you an example of where we differ.
Yes.
Where we differ. We teach, we give girls and women rights without making them understand the responsibility that comes with that by virtue of who they are.
It's empowering someone to play in a game that you don't give them rules of.
Yeah.
You spoke about divine feminine. Do you think, and this is my last, I think, tough question. Do you think that the movie of feminism is stripping away from that, from the divine nature that God has created us to be? And in no way am I saying this is right and this is wrong. What God created you to be is what it is what you are. But do you think the feminism movement and the stripping away from the position that God placed Adam and placed Eve and said, you function here and you function here, us wanting to now say, in that court, is it now not stripping away from what function I've been given?
The feminism that says we can be like men, is definitely stripping away from that. We're not men, and we can't be like men. We were created to do what men can't do.
Yeah.
We're not created to do what men can do. Otherwise, there won't be a balance of function. And so in some aspect, in some regard, I think so. And I have to be careful in answering this question because I don't want it to be uniform for everyone. Because like I say, feminism is ihlukile. Kunabanye abawu-outright abathi nje, hey, thina nje indaba amadoda siyingena sifune madoda. Kube nabanye who speak the equality language, kube nabanye who speak the dominance language. So in some conversations, in some circles, I do think it does take away from the divine femininity. Because like I say, the stance is defensive rather than owning who you are.
And functioning in that role.
And functioning in that role.
Ngiyafisa ukuhlangana nawe pulpit one day as Ngiyafisa. Not a podium. I know there's a difference. Ngiyafisa. Do you dabble in that? You speak about God a lot. So.
No, I don't.
Yeah.
I haven't been to church in years. I don't even remember when last I was in church. Again, when I went on this journey, Khulekani, ngaye kukusonta.
Is it?
Yeah.
Now I need to dabble into that. I need to understand that. See, you are just a book of many chapters.
There's a chapter in my book called God, Church and I. And it speaks specifically to this, my journey of finding God for myself. I felt like there was so much that was imposed on me by religious circles and structures and religious people, that I was very active in God's spaces, but I wasn't very close to God. I was just active in spaces that proclaim God and Christ. That's you know. And so one of the things I prayed for was a true revelation of who God is.
And a true relationship.
Zimbulek mina ngikubone ukuthi ubani, ngingakuboni ngeso lomfundisi, ngingakuboni ngeso labantu abamalapha, ngicela ukukubona mina for me and the way I understand myself. And I've come to appreciate that we all engage with God and connect with God in different ways. Mina nje, for instance, mangaweshipanga khona into enganyakazi emoyeni wami.
I think you and I are the same.
Mangaweshipanga, khona nje into enganyakazi, and many a times worship for me is prayer. So akusadinga ukuthi bese ngiyoguqa futhi bese ngiyathandaza. kodwa nginendlela yami yokuxhumana noNkulunkulu wami. And having been isolated for so long, nokusondelana naye ngalendlela esengisondelene nayo, akuselula manje ukungibhayizisa. Kuningi okwenzakalayo emasontweni,
That's too much.
emabandleni ongekho right. Wakwangena enkonzweni uma ungena la yaqhumi weshe kodwa usuyangena kuyabantu moya ngcwele uyazwa nje ukuthi kade wahamba la. Kade wahamba moya ngcwele la. Iziphele inkosi hayibo moya ngcwele
But there's opulence, there's excellence, everything is nice.
Konke.
Yeah.
Konke kodwa usuthi ngase ngilapho. La ngithi angimuzwa uNkulunkulu, angimfeel and ngifuna ukumfeel because ngingane yaNkulunkulu ngiyazazi.
And I applaud you for that. There's not many people. I don't like the gullibility that we have when it comes to church. There's a lot of people in churches, structures, they have such a level of gullibility of believing what is said over there, over and above anything else. That's what he said, that goes. And I think we can break it down now. What does Christmas look like at your household?
My household.
Do you have Christmas trees, mistletoe? Do you have Santa Claus?
I have been making a very conscious decision to create the kind of environment that Christmas afforded me as a child growing up for my own children. So, uKrismus kumina ngisempaphala ekhaya ishowe kaboma ngozungu manzini ogwabini onyamaka ishisha amabhebhezelo.
Issue.
Sifike around maybe 3-4 days before Christmas, and then kuyaplanwa ukuthi kuzokwenziwani. My sisters were in Joburg, cousin sisters were in Joburg. Sehle sonke ney'ngane. And I say this because it's become a very conscious, intentional thing that we do for our children, having lost a lot of time as a family.
Yeah.
Because kwakunokuqhelelana. And we became that generation that said, this thing ayenzeka kule generation before asifuni yenzeke kuthina futhi asifuni yenzeke ey'nganeni zethu. So we became very intentional about bringing everybody back to the source, and the source being ugogo nomkhulu AB, u-AB being iJapan umkhulu wami ozala uma wami, bese kuba uMantuli ugcina abantu. Why Japan? Because yeah, my grandfather was a character and a half, man. You must read the book to get to know my grandfather. My grandfather was a businessman. A show wani laha ne moba, and then at some point he was principally in Papala Primary, and then of course later on in life he followed his calling, which was ministry, so he became a pastor. Not a pastor, a reverend. I think there's a difference. He became a reverend. Yeah. Reverend Zungu, AP Zungu. But why Japan ngoba abantu basebaphala bamhlonipha for his business acumen. He was very well traveled, and a very educated lad. Yeah. So yeah, that's why he was called Japan. He was very business minded, very intelligent man, healthy also, very health conscious. Why you walk, mkhulu, like why you walk, exercise, I stretch on the grass. He listened to classical music. He was a deep man. He was a deep man. Yeah. So we've made a conscious, intentional decision to go back to that source of home, Amagceke or Zungu, and to create that environment for our children. We're hoping that this year we're going to have one of the bigger Christmases that we've had in comparison to over the years, because as a smart the intention is that yeah.
Well, man, isisho sabilungu siyasho ukuthi home is where the heart is, and this Christmas day, be home be with family, however that manifests itself for you. I know there's a few people who are closer to friends and relatives, abanye, kanjalo kanjalo. But Christmas time is a time for family, it's a time for love, it's a time for people that you appreciate empilweni yakho. Share that love. Batshena ukuthi uyabathanda, ngisho ngabe you are not with them today. Make sure that you send a text, call them up, umtshela ukuthi ekuse ngidla amaswiti la and I'm thinking of you. No custard pamwami, and I'm definitely thinking of you. So we definitely hope that you enjoyed this Christmas special. It was a bit deep for Christmas Day, but I had to. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much for having me. I'm enjoying my time in Durban, and yeah, it's good to be back home.
People abangayibuki ishow abalele under rock, perhaps about Kokama subscriptions. Where can we watch you?
We are currently on Sibongile and the Dlaminis, which is Mondays to Wednesdays. Oh, we're hoping that next year will be Mondays to Fridays, but as Mondays to Wednesdays at 6:30 on 163 Mzansi Wethu. Yeah.
It's currently doing very, very well, so make sure that you watch there. Kunezinga le opulence lapha, so ungalindeli uphumelele. That's all I'm saying. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. This was fun. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.